This is a repeat of what we did yesterday, so if you came to hear the same thing again, awesome. If you heard it and didn't realize it, yeah, in theory it'll be the exact same thing, hopefully without the mishaps of the internet and stuff that we had yesterday. But this is a deep dive into the Lync 2013 client sign-in process. The focus will be more on the fact client because it's easy to show what's going on. The processes will apply to all clients, and we'll go through some of them and even some aspects of some troubleshooting on the mobility client to see how that works and how we get to know what's going on, right? So there are two basic concepts when we're talking about the client sign-in process. We have discovery and we have authentication. So we're going to start with discovery, since that's where the process starts, is with discovery. Discovery is exactly what it says. For obvious reasons, if you hard code and set the pool information in the Lync client, we're not doing discovery. You're actually told it where to go. So this is the concept of an auto-discover type process where we're trying to figure out, based off your login name, where do you go, who are you, what pool should you be in. The client process has evolved from the 2010 to the 2013 world. And in the 2010 world, pre-CU4, as I recall, pre-Lync Discover, pre-mobility in 2010, it was the exact same process that we've had since the LCS days. So since 2003, it's all been DNS, SRV records, looking things up. They themselves have evolved slightly. But in general, it's been DNS and SRV lookups. With the introduction of mobility, auto-discover was introduced because we needed something deeper than what we were getting through the server lookup process. And then the clients went ahead and evolved in taking that on as well. So you can expect that as things progress and move on, Lync Discover will be where we're going. That's what everything's going to be using at some point, to some extent. Anything new. We still have the SRV services. There's still some requirements from a backwards compatibility perspective, as well as from Federation, for instance, that's going to be using DNS SRVs. But in general, and in theory, even that process could turn into one where Federation is all done via this lookup process. Okay, so in the Lync 2010 client, we had DNS SRV, and that's all it was. It then evolved to include from the mobility, but that's out of scope. So then the Lync 2013 introduced Lync Discover as its primary mechanism for lookup, and then DNS SRV was used as its secondary. Then we went and introduced mobility, and again in 2010, well, since the 2010 client and 2013, that was a requirement. In fact, once you deployed as part of the deployment process of 2010 for mobility, you had to make sure you had this Lync Discover internal and Lync Discover record. Otherwise, things didn't work because that's all it looked at. Conversely, we look at the phone edition or the LPE, there is no other option but the SRV records. And more than likely, with pretty good assurity, that will never change, right? It will never change because it's not, well, developmentally, it's at end of life. In and of itself, the phone editions exist and will for some time, but there is no current plan to further deploy the Lync Phone Edition version, which you buy on the Microsoft phone, so there's no reason to change the architecture. And then the Lync Windows Store app, or the Modern app, or the Forbidden Metro Word app, right? This app only used the Lync Discover process, and so a lot of individuals were complaining and having issues where it didn't work. And again, just because your FAT client works and another client doesn't mean the whole process is broken, but it could mean that one of the discovery processes is broken. And so a great way when we're kind of looking at what's going on would be to simply say, hey, do these certain clients work and these certain clients do not? Maybe that can lead into what's actually going on in the environment. So why change Lync Discover? Why create Lync Discover? Why get away from the DNS SRVs? And there were definitely advantages and still are some advantages to both. The DNS SRV was nice because it was a really simple process that once embraced, everybody kind of understood, right? We had problems initially, and this would be back in the early LCS days, so 2004, 2005, where SRV records weren't necessarily supported externally by your DNS provider. It all had to do with older bind versions, and if they were in fact older, you either moved to a different provider or you kind of threw up your hands and said, whoops, I guess that's not going to happen. So then Microsoft introduced into the DNS world also SIP internal and SIP external to try to handle the inability to do SRVs and problems there, but Federation could never do without it, so we moved on. That's not so much a problem anymore at all. But again, the SRV record's limited to just giving back a response. It's also an unauthenticated response. Anybody can go ahead and look up your DNS record and get back whatever you set in that name field of the SRV and port, and theoretically can start some process to go and do some kind of denial of service or an attack because they have at least a known open port and a name of where to go. So, not necessarily a great process. It's not something, and you can say, so do mail servers. It's very true, but we're always trying to make things better, and in that instance, that didn't help us any. The FAT clients and legacy clients are going to require it, so it's not like we can get rid of it. It's not like something that is yesterday's news, and then we're going to be Lync Discover only, but in fact, it's going to be here in addition to Lync Discover. So when we talk about Lync Discover, what is it, how it worked? It's much like, and for those that are familiar with the Exchange Auto Discover process, very similar. It's a process where it's an authenticated request, so you can request to get Lync Discover, but in order to get past the Lync Discover and into the Auto Discover process, you have to have Active Directory valid credentials to get this process going. So that has a lot of positive implications, which we'll see later on as well, from preventing communication to your servers, to your edge servers, typically, because they are not even, there's no traffic going to them. You can't even get to the point where you find out where to go because you can't get and finish the Lync Discover process. So what we can do in the Lync Discover, which we couldn't do in the SRV was a single answer. It was going to return a pool name. Potentially you have multiple records so that they are scaled. You have a SRV with a value of 10, an SRV with a value of 20, so you have this failover kind of process. Great HA solution, which we don't have with Lync Discover. It's a single A record. But when we get our response back, we now can find out where your pool is, what server you're actually going to, which edge server you're going to be going to, what are your namespaces for different things, and we'll see a bunch of them, such as your scheduler, such as your MCX, such as your mobility. Where do we actually go? And it's given right back in that XML data file dump that we get back. That's something that we can't do, and there's no way to accomplish with a single response without additional queries and information, so it's much more efficient. That's what allows a 2013 user with multiple edge servers in disparate locations to, yes, they query Lync Discover, let's say, in North America, but then after they get the response back, they're directly going to their EU pool or to their APAC pool or wherever the case may be, very direct. We're not having to do SIP traffic directly to and from, federation aside, from the single pool that's pointed within DNS. Again, certificate trusted, auto discover, requires auth, and we'll get and see much of that once we get to authorization. So the 2013 client, looking specifically at the FAT client, how does it work? What is its process? So Lync Discover has a very defined process of starting internal and then we go external. We're looking to see, are you inside? And if you're not inside, are you outside? And if you're not outside, then we don't know where you are, and then we kind of fails there. So we check for the internal record. If that internal fails, then we check for the external. Now, depending on the client, that internal fail could be a certificate failure. You don't trust the root of the certificate of your internal, and so, well, we actually can't do a query because we don't have a secure communications. Lync's all about security, so if we don't have a secure end-to-end, we just kind of dump it. However, we can then go and push on to the external record, again, depending on client. So we'll get more into that. Mostly facing the mobility clients where sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, depending on the version, depending on what you've downloaded, for which store update, things of that nature. So after we do internal, then we go to the external. Now, if that fails with the 2013 FAT client, we don't stop. We then go and say, okay, well, they don't have Lync Discover, but do they have SRV records or A records that will get me in? So we start with a SIP internal TLS here. Nope, SIP TLS. Now, it's probably going to stop there if we actually have DNS correctly configured, inside or outside, because that's going to be our record to tell us which pool to go back to in the port. 5061 internal, 443 external, right? But if none of those happen to be there, or whatever, we just don't get a response back, the client will then just start to say, well, let's just try to guess what we're trying to get to and see if we get a response back. And we start with SIP internal dot, whatever your domain name is after your @, so your SIP URI. That's not there, then we go to look to SIP. And if that's not there, then we do SIP external. And again, that fixes the problem if we can't do SRV records, then in theory, we could have a SIP record for our domain, and you could get to everything, and we'll actually see that work. Okay. Once all of that gets done, then we start the web query process, and HTTPS kicks in, and we start to query who are we, where are we going, who's authenticated, who's not authenticated. And it's all within the client just discovery process. So when we look at it, and we're looking at the actual process of what we're looking for, you can see, and this is a Wireshark capture. It's important to note that I don't care what tool you use, what version, what product, what manufacturer, it really makes no difference. However you get your captures, get your captures. Whatever you're comfortable with, awesome. This happens to be Wireshark, easy to maintain, query. Here we are. So looking at this, you can see Lync discovers and internals are queried. Then we move on, and we get to SIP internal TLS. And then we move on and get to SIP TLS. And then we don't get that back, so now we're querying SIP, then SIP internal again, then SIP again, then SIP external, and then basically we dump. We say that's not going to happen. And we get the error on this side that says DNS doesn't work. Something's not right. Make sure we can't find anything about your domain in the DNS world, so either Lync's not deployed or you haven't configured DNS. Now sometimes you'll see the beautiful Lync warning message that pops up, and this is frustrating to some. But in reality, this is a Windows security feature. It has nothing to do with Lync. It has to do with the trusted domain differences. So we're going to see this in generally two different instances. There's multiple times this can happen. But the most common are you are traveling somewhere else. And where that somewhere else is some, let's say, going to Microsoft. Right? We're at on Microsoft campus. We have our own internal contoso.com domain, although they probably have that, so you wouldn't get it. But if whatever your domain is, you go to log into Lync, as soon as you do, it's going to pop this up. And what's happening is the DHCP options in the Microsoft network are being pushed back to you, and preferentially it's saying, hey, are you supposed to go to the Lync server, the Microsoft ones? And you say, nope, try again, and then it does the DNS query and gets into this procedure to try to figure out where you're at. The other times it happens is when your pool name is different than your SIP URI name. So it's a theoretically fixed. It's one of those things that Microsoft fixes in an update and then breaks in another cumulative update, and then the Office team breaks in another update, so it just goes on and on. But the ultimate fix is to simply, there's a group policy that you can put in that says, trust my domain, and if it doesn't match, just let it go through. Obviously, you could say always trust and go ahead, and that works too. But ideally, end users aren't given that pop-up ever. That's never a good thing. So anyway, from an internal failure perspective on a DNS query, when we don't get anything back, we're going to go through the entire list exhaustively. And when we give up, that's when we're going to get the error here that says, fine, I don't know who you are or where I am. Now, if it does work, and it's via Lync Discover, the process looks completely different. So we start off with a Lync Discover internal. And then depending on how quickly your DNS server responds, we may also then just push out a Lync Discover request too. We're like, well, we don't have time to wait. Let's just push things out and then get responses back. In a virtual world, if you're doing this, you'll often see where we're doing multiple queries because things are just slower, especially when it's a VM world of a demo environment that's all running on a little PC. So in this environment, we did Lync Discover internal, and we did Lync Discover. And then Lync Discover internal came back with a response, and that response has the actual pool name in it. And then we do a query for the pool name. And once we get there, we get the auto discovers then going to start because we're going to do exchange lookups. EWS is going to kick in. We're all happy-go-lucky. We know where we're going, and things start that process. The important thing to remember, and highly imperative that you recall this, is that when we log in successfully, when we have made it one time on whatever computer you're in, now it's obviously profile and computer specific, but once you get into the machine, we don't do this process over and over and over. Kind of seems like, well, there's a really good chance that if yesterday I went to this pool and this was the name that it gave me back, I can go there again today and I'm going to get there as well. All right? I'm going to get the same response, so why do the query? If it does the query or tries to get there and it doesn't work, it will kick the process over. But the important thing is that on the bottom, the subsequent logins, all we do is go directly to the pool. We don't even bother going to Lync Discover. We don't bother going to, if we've made our name being SIP, Lync Discover is given our exact pool back, so off we go. Now, if, in fact, we hit the pool, and when we hit the pool, we've been moved, or it happens either because a user has moved us to a different pool, perhaps our server physically has changed, into a different environment, whatever the case may be, then we'll get a 301 redirect. But that'll happen on the Lync server side. That's not happening in discovery. As far as discovery is concerned, as long as I can get back to the pool that I got to last time, that's where I'm going to go. Okay? So when we're doing troubleshooting, there's some steps we'll need to do to make sure we're clearing out this information to make the computer discover. Otherwise, it's really hard to troubleshoot when it's just working on one machine and we can't get it to fail, and that would be why. Because he's already got there once, he doesn't have to do discovery again. Okay? When we do an SRV lookup, the process is very similar with the exception of, and in this case, one of the answers we saw at the very beginning of the things we search for when we don't know anything, when we can't get to anywhere, is with SIP, right? We go to SIP in your domain name. So 99.999% of the time, when I deploy a Lync pool, I include the SIP name as the pool name in the certificate and make the SIP records just like I would the pool name records, and they're ambiguous, and then I just put them in into my SRV as the SIP. The advantage of that is it's completely separated from the pool. I can decide that I want to authenticate to a different pool, simply updating the DNS and pointing it to a different record. Now I'm going to a different pool. It's still SIP. So the client's still going to SIP. The client doesn't know any different. I mean, the client's still going to query for an A record of SIP, right? It's going to get a response back of what it is. But it no longer has to figure out any changes to the environment. It makes it very clean, very easy to get things going from a migration, maintenance, however you want to look at it. It gets future-proofs yourself is what it does. So in this instance, we did Lync discover. No response, no response, no response. And then we do SIP internal TLS. Now, SIP internal TLS is an older SRV record, as are SIP internal and SIP external. However, we are going to query for them. If you look in your client logs, you will see errors that are saying, not found, right? I went to log in, I didn't find this record the very first time we log in and do this. Again, once I get in, I never do this process again, so it really doesn't matter. But if you're really, really, I don't know, anal in the fact that you don't want to ever have errors anywhere, well, then we can create this record. It doesn't hurt to create the record. We'll find it. We're going to stop as soon as we get to the record we want to get. Now, ideally, we have Lync discover, so we'll never be using these from an internal user perspective anyway. But it doesn't hurt to add all the records from every potential type all over your DNS system, as long as you manage DNS and the person that is deciding if they can go there is you, then what do you care? If you have to debate it, it's not worth the debate. But again, you can make these DNS records internally all you want. So in this case, we found the SIP _SIP ._TLS record, and it returned back the query of SIP. So that's what we had said in our SRV record. And then we do a query on SIP, and then that ends up telling us that IP, and we get then to the pool, and voila, we're now being able to get to the login process. Subsequent, like I said, even though we know our pool, because it wasn't delivered via the Lync discover process, in reality, our answer was SIP, was where we're going. So in subsequent logins, we're going to go back to SIP. We're always going back to SIP. When we do so, we then figure out that we're actually on the pool, and then off we go again. So a slightly millisecond second difference, because we're doing one extra query, but that's the SRV. So the difference, again, really to focus on is the fact that if we don't have Lync discovered, the fact client's still going to get in as long as our DNS records are there. And we want all of our DNS records there in all instances to get full functionality, even if you're not doing the mobility side, because the Lync client will utilize it, the Lync 2013 client, and it's a better process. It's a better login. Okay? So once we finally get back where our pools are, that's when the Lync discover starts to go and figure out where things are going. So in this example, our Lync discover starts, and again, we push to Lync discover, and our variable is our domain name, says who we are, right? So this is Davey Crockett, so dc@brightcomplabs.com. He is being pushed to Lync discover internal. Lync discover is then coming back with a response. You'll see there's a 502 for Lync discover because that's not a record that I created internally. Typically, we actually would if we want to get a workaround for mobility, but in this instance, it's allowed, so I didn't. So once we get that response back, we get a web ticket, normal authentication process. We have to go and be able to communicate securely with the server. Once we get that ticket, we can then go to auto-discover process. And now we're authenticated. Now we know who we are. And we're going to go ahead and kick back our response of all of our information. And if you look at what's kicked back in auto-discover, there's all kinds of stuff we may or may not need. From a client perspective, it depends on what client's asking for the information. Later on, when we get to show some some data on mobility, we'll actually see that. We'll see that the UCWA information, which is what the mobility client's going over, that's what it's looking for. It's just looking for the response. So it gets back all this XML data, but all it wants is external UCWA. So external, well, what about internal UCWA? Well, ironically or otherwise, it's never used with a Lync mobility client. We do provide it. We do tell you where your internal UCWA endpoint is. We just don't use it. So that's the way it goes. You will always be going to the external. So if you don't make that record for the external name to point to your reverse proxy to get you back in, you'll never end up where you're supposed to be when you're trying to do mobility. And that's where all of the flow process typically break, is that in this case, we have UCWA external is meetings.brightcomp labs. If you don't have an A record for that points to a reverse proxy that'll get you to the external 4443 port on your front ends, mobility is broken. Because that's where we're going. We are not going to the inside. The same is true on the MCX. And the reason for that from the Microsoft perspective was, in theory, from a mobility, you could come in from the outside and come right back onto the inside network, and you're still talking to the same web service ports, the same end game in theory, so your communications is all still there and working. Typically it breaks, and it logs out, logs in, but in theory that would work. And so it's setting it up for all communications from mobility are all done on the outside services. Some of the other stuff that may be interesting that you end up pulling back are things like your scheduler. You say, scheduler what? Well, the scheduler service, some people may recall from the OCS days, was an optional add-on that we put on servers that allowed you to pull up a web page to schedule meetings. It was initially made for the Unix Mac crowd so they could schedule Lync meetings. It looks identical to what it was. It's not any better. Yeah, but it's still there. And it's there natively in 2013. So if you didn't know you had scheduler, you could actually look at your auto-discover rules and say, oh, if I go to this URL internally, I'm going to actually get to my scheduler page. I could log into it, and I could schedule a meeting. It won't show up on my Outlook meetings. It won't be manageable internally. It's completely separate. I won't see the ones that are on my meetings because it is completely a different environment. But hey, I can do it. You probably never will, other than to play with it. But it is there. You also see stuff like the ports that are being pushed down, right? So internally, we know we're on 5061. That's the ports we're going to. That makes sense. We also know that set up externally, we're 5061. So that's how it's set up with a single IP. So I didn't do 443. But that's OK. But that's how we're pushing these port information back. And that's how we get the information as if we were inside or outside with the port and the server and where to physically go. And again, this may be completely different for a different user because they may be on a different pool, different edge services, where they're going, how their external namespace may be different than user B's over in North America versus EMEA versus APAC, right? Everybody's going to get their own results based off how you've designed your Lync infrastructure. And that's the advantage right there of the Lync Discover process, is we get our servers back. We get our information specific to where our services live. Otherwise, yeah. So what we're going to do is try to demonstrate, assuming that everything remains up, which I'm sure it will, the whole process and how this works. So it's not difficult, maybe. It's not difficult to gather this information. It's more about finding out where the information is at and what tools to use it and to know what you're looking for. And that'll be key for troubleshooting. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with an environment that works. We're going to break it so we know what we broke and then find out how to make everything work. So as we discussed before, once you've logged in successfully, everything's happy-go-lucky. We're not going to keep looking for our stuff. So we could break DNS now, which we'll do, and it won't matter that we broke DNS because we already know how to get back to our pool. Now, if your pool records were missing, then you have a lot bigger problems than just not configuring DNS correctly. So, but in this instance, we can see we are logged in. Everything's working as expected. Yeah, everything's fine. So what we're going to do is go ahead and log out of here and exit it. Now, one thing and where the client caches this information is different based off the client version you're using. If you're 2010, or versus 2013. So we're going to look at the 13 world because that's what we're playing with. And we can, it's already there, but when we go there, it's in our app data directory, local, Microsoft, Office, 15, Lync, sign-in name, right? So yeah, that's pretty hard to get to. I don't know that I could ever remember where to go. I never remember. So how I get there is I go 10% or percent 10%. When I do that, takes me to my local temp directory. I can then go back one and then go to Microsoft. And then from Microsoft to Office, then to 15, then to Lync, and that's how I get there. And again, that allows you to go to, it's the user's temp directory is where we're putting this. This is why it's important, it's per profile. Just because a user can log into one computer, could have already logged in. If he goes to another computer, he cannot log in. We'll probably have a discovery problem issue that we're working on. So if I want to be able to test this Lync discover process over, what I need to do is flush everything in the environment. Right? I need to make this broken to the event that the computer has never been there, the client's never been there, and everything functions the way it should not function, but will function when we get it to function the way we want it to function. Got that? I know. Okay, so in the user's client directory is stored info, not only caching where we log in, it's the address book that's downloaded, photo caching that it's done. When you do custom locations within the Lync client, this is where it stores it. So you do risk losing that and having to download the address book if you're using the ABS service. But the risk is fairly minimum, especially for testing, and no risk here in the lab. So we're going to go ahead and just physically delete it. You have to be actually out of the client in order to delete this directory. It does lock it open. So make sure you've completely exited. Now, the next thing we're going to do is, because he's logged in, we know we have DNS cache. And if we do an ipconfig display DNS, we get back all the records that we have currently looked up and cached, right? So in those records, we're going to have our Lync pool server. We already know where that is. We already have information back. Click there. On SIP. So it would actually not have to have DNS records in order to get there, because the client already knows how to get there. A reboot, and we would be in trouble. But in this instance, we want to be in trouble. So we're going to do an ipconfig. I do not want to reboot, as it is a lab VM environment, and may not only not come back, but it will take forever to come back. So flush DNS clears my cache. Now, I personally always then go and display it again, and I'd want to see nothing there. If you do see something there, one of the things you may be troubleshooting and actually fighting are host entries on a machine. So host entries will automatically be there even if you flushed your cache, because that's what a host file is for, right? So always flush, go look at your cache and make sure you very well may want some host record entries in there, but be aware that they're in there. Make sure that it's like, oh, why is SIP still here? Nothing should be querying out of my box, and if I've just flushed it, let me go look at my host file. All right, okay. So as this box stands right now, he has no DNS knowledge of the world. He also has no information about being previously logged in. So now we can jump to the domain controller, where we have active user. Davey's there, Lone Ranger's there, and Big Bird. They're all happily working for this company. Anyway, and we have records. So some of these records are our SIP record, which again is in the certificate, and that's why it works. When you run through the certificate wizard as a side, and it asks you, do you have Lync Phone Edition in your environment? And if so, do you want to go ahead and include support for it? You check the little box and then move on. It adds SIP to your environment. And what that was for was in the olden days, so we're talking Tang-J pre-Lync 2013, it was actually a requirement for it to get there. It's not today, but it is a great thing to have in there anyway, because like I said, it's a kind of a fallback, fail-safe environment for us to have. So here's my SIP record, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it and say that's not going to work. Yes. And then I'm going to say Lync Discover Internal. Now again, you can have Lync Discover in here as well, and the reason we'd want Lync Discover is for that process of where we have mobile devices that do not support our internal root certificate, and so when it fails on trying to get to Lync Discover Internal, because it'll find it, it just won't be able to query it, it'll then automatically fail down to Lync Discover Internal and get the results back. In theory, your Lync Discover Internal is pointing to a reverse proxy inside, which has an external certificate associated to it by whomever, DigiCert, Intrust, GoDaddy, whatever, and from there, the client's going to be able to trust that certificate and move on. That typically works on, today, that does work on the iOS devices as expected. That does not work on the Windows Phone devices as expected. And it's irrelevant on the Android, because Android allows you to hit next and just ignore the certificate warning and keep going. So we just keep going. But previously, and that would be back one revision ago, CU3, which was 3 months ago, it did work correctly. So something broke in the process, but FYI. So yeah, you have to deal with it. Okay, now we also have our SRV record, and in this case, I have my SIP. And again, my SIP is pointing to SIP, right, on 5061. I'm going to go ahead and delete him too. So now I have nothing from a discovery process in my internal DNS, nothing that would allow my user or client to get in. Because even though I don't have Lync Discover, and even though I do not have an SRV record, SIP TLS, I did have SIP as an A record, but I deleted that too. So I don't have any way to know what's the what. And I don't have the DHCP settings set, which theoretically we could rely on to some extent, because we can, right? We're going to take any information we can get. However, more than likely, our pool information was set to SIP in our DHCP, and we just deleted that so it wouldn't get to where it wanted to go anyway. So this is all good. So this should not work. That's what we want. So we're going to clear our cache, make sure there's no information that the domain controller can kick back. We come back to our Lync client, and before we start this process, we want to go ahead and find our mouse. All right. So we want to go ahead and start a Wireshark. We want to see what's going on in the background process. And did I? Oh, that's Lync server. No wonder. Never mind. There. So first we're going to make sure we still have no real information, right? Nothing's been querying anything. Eventually you're going to see a domain controller in there. You're going to see various things going on as we query stuff. But it's been idle, right? The box is doing nothing. Then we're going to come over to Wireshark, and we are going to restart. So we get a nice clean query. One thing we can do in Wireshark, and most, is filter. So we're going to filter just on DNS queries at this point. We want to see what's going on, and nothing's been queried from DNS. Again, if you have a query, if you're watching DNS and you're looking for queries in a Wireshark type application, and nothing comes back, it's because it's already cached. Something's in your box. It doesn't need to go ask DNS where it's at. So you need to make sure that your box is physically clean in that sense. And then we are going to attempt, there we go, launch Lync. And we know the environment works. We know Lync's up. But as we come through this process, there went all of our responses, no such name, no such name, no such name, no such name. It doesn't exist. We went through all of the name processes that we could potentially hit, that we think we should be hitting. You also notice that it happens to go to Bing, happens to go to Microsoft. That's the Lync client going out and doing his checks as well. So we can ignore those things, but what we want to look at is the fact that it starts with the Lync Discover internal processes and fails, and then and everything, blah, blah, blah. Off we go over and over and over and over, and nothing comes back, right? So we know that the process doesn't work. We know that the DNS name is a requirement here. From a simple perspective, and to prove out, well, we can also do this too. One really simple thing to do from a troubleshooting perspective is if things aren't working the way you expect them to work, or you can't do the discovery process, do an ipconfig display DNS. See what the client got back when it did a query. We don't need to be running Wireshark or anything like that to get that information. We just go look at the DNS cache. And when we look here, we can see we talk to the domain controller because he's our DNS. So that's good. That works. If that comes back unknown, we probably have a bigger DNS problem and a bigger environmental problem at that point. But we did not get a response back for this SRV record SIP internal. As we go up and we look at things, we did not get an answer back for SIP, because we did search for that. We didn't get it back for SIP TLS. Again, we looked for that. No responses. Lync Discover, not there. Things aren't happening. And SIP external. So all the things we searched for came back as no. You may be getting back an answer, but it may not be the answer you want. And that would be where if we did a display DNS, we could say, oh, either typo or that's not right, or why are we going there? And that's kind of bizarre, right? So just using DNS, we can get this simple information back very quickly from a client perspective to see if it's even querying correctly. Where are we going? Why are we not getting stuff back? Okay, we're going to clear that, flush it back out, and then we're going to go back to our domain controller, and we're going to only make the SIP address, the .70, so we're going to make a new A record. Now, and as we tangent around, the one thing when we're making DNS records and when we're looking at things, one thing that can break us, not in this process, but when we get to the authentication process, is are we making A records or are we making CNAME records? Generally speaking, A records are, well, not generally speaking, definitively, A records will always work for all answers. There are a few exceptions where CNAME will work as well, and that would include anything that's a web service related, so your meet, your dial-in, Lync Discover would work as a CNAME. However, in my experience, it's just easier to tell the DNS group, just make me A records, because otherwise you have to say which ones you do, which ones you don't. It's never made correctly. They can argue all they want about it not being best practice, but some of them have to be, like our pool names, have to be in there as A records, otherwise authentication fails. So they're going to have to do it at least for some of the records. Why not just do them all and make your life easy? So, and SIP would be one of them where we would have to be an A record, otherwise we won't trust it. And that's our DNS man-in-the-middle prevention authentication stuff. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and make this record and happily create him. Then we're going to, for good measure, flush our cache to make sure he should have overridden his cache, but time and, yeah, labs. So we'll make sure that it's flushed. So now when we come back to the client, and the client goes to log in again, let's restart this so we get a nice clean look. Okay. We can see the process goes to almost the exact same process, but we stop at SIP. Oh, we got an answer back. And not only did we get an answer back, it's a valid answer, right? We can actually get there. Just because we got the answer back, if I'd pointed it to the wrong IP, it would have failed just as we did other, it just wouldn't have shown a DNS error. It would have said the pool is having a problem, the pool's down. So we have to not only have the records there, we also have to have the right records there pointing to valid information. But again, that information we'd be able to troubleshoot if it wasn't working, and it should not be working then for any new login. And that's where things get really difficult in the Lync world, is where Lync does everything it can in its power to make sure you can log in, stay logged in, and communicate appropriately, right? We're looking at every potential IP combination and port combination we can. We're looking at all the various avenues of Lync Discover, SRV records. We'll look for just SIP. We don't care. We want to get you into the client. That's awesome from keeping you up. That's terrible from a troubleshooting perspective, because there's so many things and so many ways that we can be broken and so many different things that we have to look at. So while 90% of the company is working, it's only new hires that aren't. Well, that may very well be because Discovery is broken. So they already are logged in, and so everything's working. So it can be very misleading, and we just need to make sure that things are the way that we want them to be. Okay, so that is the SRV, and everything works there. Okay, nice and works. Now we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it with Lync Discover. And when we do it with Lync Discover, we're also going to get a capture in Fiddler. A Fiddler, for those that aren't aware, again, I don't know, it's freeware, shareware, one of those two. It's a product you can download and use for free that allows you to decrypt, if you so opt to, the HTTPS traffic coming to your machine. So what that means is, not only do I get to see that the HTTPS traffic came, because I can come here and I can definitely see, is it SSO? Yes. The traffic is transferred, and we have a certificate exchange, and it's all good and yay, but what? I mean, it's encrypted. That's the point of Lync, right, is that everything is encrypted. So it doesn't do us any good to see what information is coming back. That's where Fiddler jumps into our kind of tool set. It allows us to look at the various things, including the content of this. And how it does it is it interjects a certificate into the path of all communications. It pops up a nice, pretty warning saying, are you sure you want to do this? Because we're installing a certificate into your certificate store and impersonating all communications that come from you, and you have to accept it, okay, 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 and after you give some blood, it goes ahead and installs the certificate, right? There is a potential risk, and it is something that you don't necessarily want to leave on at all times, and it can cause other issues, but from what we're trying to do, it works perfect, because we'll be able to see the traffic come in, the requests go out, the data come back, and what was returned to us. So we're going to do that as well. So let us go ahead and sign out of here and delete his sign-in info. When we do so, we delete some registry information. Oh, I need to exit him. And then we're going to this mouse. Let me just do it this way. Okay. We're going to go ahead and delete it and make sure we get a full discovery again, because we know where to go. We don't want that. We're going to flush our cache, restart this process, and then from a server, from a domain controller perspective, we're going to remove SIP, or maybe not. Again, we don't look to that unless we can't get to Lync Discover. So because it's there, it doesn't mean anything other than there's a record there. So we're going to go ahead and make a Lync Discover Lync discover internal, and it has to be spelled right. Hopefully it is. And then we're going to do 10.128.100.70. Again, this would be to your hardware load balancer if, in fact, you had an enterprise pool. This is an SE, so there's only one box to go to, but it would be to a reverse proxy potentially, not the internal, but not the internal, but the just Lync discover, right? So this one, we want the answer to come back from 443. We want to be inside. So now we have a record. We have Lync discover. We also happen to have SIP. We don't have any SRVs, which is interestingly good. Clear our cache here. Come back to our client. And open Fiddler and Wireshark. Okay, so we're going to start this capture. So he's looking. Now he's looking at any traffic. We do have the option to kind of pare it down. Ideally, you don't have a bunch of stuff up and running. If you have Outlook web app open or you're running RPC over HTTP, from a Exchange perspective, you're going to be seeing all kinds of traffic too. So you want to quiet down your box when you're doing any of these traces. I don't care what you're using, but it makes your life that much easier if you're not just generating tons of traffic that you're going to have to parse through. So we're not doing anything right now, and so off we go. Okay, so it says we're capturing. It says we're getting data. We're going to go ahead and launch Lync once again. But did I start Wireshark? No. Okay, starting Wireshark, and we can see good old Windows looking for Bing. Okay, we come back and we launch Lync, and when we do, we're going to get tons of info. There comes our Lync discover. Discover process is happening. You also notice a bunch of Exchange web services are happening. That's over HTTPS as well, right? So we're going to get all that information as we're trying to log into our various boxes. Things are going to get in. At this point, we're troubleshooting not the discovery per se, because we know we can get to Lync discover. We've validated that we're getting there from a Wireshark perspective, and now we're going down the Fiddler path. So I'm looking here. I'm saying, oh, yep, sure enough, I have a response that comes back from Lync discover internal. It is able to get to my pool, and off I go. It's all good. So we're happy there. And you also notice he pulls back information on your Exchange server. All that information is coming back because auto discovers are kicking off. We're doing other things because we're getting through the process. However, if we're having trouble with the response we're getting back, that's where we're going to go to Fiddler. Fiddler is going to go through the process of getting their query that we saw. And here's our query that we're doing for Lync discover internal. We'll also see that we have a 501 or 502. Yep. If we had a bunch of red in here and we were never getting 200 responses, chances are something's not right. Chances are it's probably a certificate is invalid, or we don't trust it, or the name's wrong, or we're having some sort of communication problem in order to get things up. So when we're looking at Exchange Web Services, that could very well be a lot of red in here if things aren't configured in EWS correctly, right? If things aren't working like we think they will. Now we have the nice, beautiful option of actually parsing this information for us, so we will do so. And we can say we want to do a Lync discover, no response. Lync discover, oh look, Lync discover is giving us back our information, a very basic where to go for our auto discover process. So Lync discover is auto discover, right? We're actually looking to find out where do I go to go get my information. Once I have that information, it's now a secure request. So when I'm going to my request, and we can see we're doing a web ticket exchange, we get our information back so that the actual certificate that's issued by the Lync server is passed and validated back and forth to you, client handshake and server handshake, and then we do an auto-discover query. And that's the results we saw in the screenshot before. We're actually pulling back all our information. A great thing to do here is to actually validate that what's being pushed back is what you're expecting to be pushed back. If you're looking here and going, no, that's not my pool and that's not my port, well then maybe there's something either you're not aware of or that the server's not quite right. I find when it's late at night and I'm working on somewhere in EMEA or APAC and they want their day, and I have my own clients that I'm doing their day, plus them at the night doing these 24, 36-hour marathons, it's not uncommon that I fat finger something and I type things in wrong. And then the eyes are pinned open, trying to see what's going on. This is where I'm going to go to. I'm going to say, okay, just tell me what I put in. Is it what I expected to put in? And when you get these long names, they can be fairly interesting from a client requirement perspective. It may look very difficult. In fact, my own are All-Star BCL 2013, so Brightcomp Labs 2013, and then a 2 or 3 acronym for the server properties. That can be very confusing because they all look the same. You're like, more Red Bull, please, because I don't know. And that's where we have the advantage of looking and seeing what the client's getting back. It's always nice to know what you should be getting back, but this is definitively, this is what we're getting back and what we're going off of. So once we get this information back, then we go to the supervisioning, we move on. You'll see we look to who are response groups. Are we in response groups? Are we actually logging into those? We have to look at that process, and off we go. And now Exchange kicks in and gets all messy, and we start to look at EWS, right? And Exchange denies, okay, denies, okay, denies, that's normal. That's just the way EWS likes to play. But in the end, you should have 200, yep. Every time he wants to query, no, yes, no, yes. And we'll see some of that when we get to authentication here in just a sec. We do the same thing to some extent. When we do TLS DSK, we deny, well, any actually authentication. When you try to talk to Lync, Lync's first response is, go away. Don't want to talk to you. But if you do want to talk, here's my conversation of what I will talk on. So again, we'll see that in just a sec. But the point of Fiddler is to see the responses and to decrypt the responses. And to set it up, for those that need to know, simply under Tools, Fiddler Options, and on the second tab is HTTPS. So it's fairly clear. And the option, decrypt HTTPS traffic. It's, again, obvious. But once you click it, you're going to get all kinds of pop-ups and warnings. And again, you just hit OK, yep. You have to be administrative to yourself to put it on, but beyond that, it's in your own store, so it's good to go. All righty. So with that, we will then move on. All right, to the Lync Windows Store app. Now, how does the Lync Windows Store app work? We saw, okay, potentially, but it depends on what you're using it for and what your client requirements are. It's only going to use Lync Discover. So if we had the SIP record, again, this is where a client, the fact client did log in, even though we only had SIP.the domain, but it would have, the Lync Windows Store app certainly would not. And when the Lync Windows Store app, modern app, Metro app, was first introduced, failure rate was astronomical. People didn't have things configured correctly. So if you don't have things set up for Lync Discover to work, this doesn't work, right? Not necessarily, but there was a large part where it was internal configuration requirements because it was a change. It was a difference of what we had before. We didn't need things to work. We could have pointed things. So a good example is poor man's method of doing a reverse proxy is simply natting or padding communication from the outside to the inside, right? So I have stuff coming to my defined port, coming into my firewall on 443. I say send that to my pool. I only have a single SE, so we're all good to go. There's no load balancer to hit. Just send it to my pool on port 4443. Boom. Outside's working just like we'd expect. However, internally, that's not going to work. We're not going to be able to send it to that same firewall and hairpin things around. So all of a sudden, we don't have support for Lync Discover internally. So while we may have mobility and the Windows app working outside, it may not be working inside, simply because of the way we configured things, because it was never a requirement before. 2013 and mobility changed a lot of requirements from a Lync Discover perspective, and thus the need for us to make records both inside and outside that were authenticated and with certificates that we trusted, and all of those nice, fun issues. So key for the Lync Windows Store app is that it does the Lync Discover process identical to how the fact client does it, the big difference being that it doesn't do SRV. Now, to your point, as part of our demos, I did not do a live demo of capture this because it doesn't always work like we'd expect it to. So instead, I got it to finally fail and then capture the logs like I would to give you the screenshots of it. So, but the key here, the process is the same. And if we're capturing and looking, you'll notice it doesn't go anywhere but. One of the problems that we have with the modern client is that once you type in the name and it's wrong, it seems to cache the fact that it tried to get there, and once it tried to get there, then it never tries to go anywhere else, and everything is all, and there's no easy way to purge it out. We saw we can purge it out in the Lync client by going to our app folder, our app data folder, and deleting the SIP-URI'd folder, right? That was easy. Not so easy when we're talking about the Windows 8 interface clients. So you either bought a new computer or logged into somebody else, blew away your profile, uninstalled the Metro app, prayed it cleaned itself up, and reinstalled the app. And it's difficult. So once it's messed up, it has a tattooing effect that unfortunately breaks that particular login. In fact, I was working with the Microsoft dev team, and we see it all the time, where we're changing namespaces, and we will be searching, and I'll be logging into one of those medio.ms domains, and I'll do acquire capture, and it's trying to log into Bracon Plaza. I'm like, that's not right. It's not going to get there. It's never going to, because I've already used the machine for the particular one I have. If it's not a domain join machine, things get all different. If your certificates aren't publicly accessible from a CRIO perspective or a certificate revocation list perspective, the modern client doesn't work. There's all kinds of things that everything has to be right in order for this app to work. When it does work, it works pretty well. When it doesn't work at all. And you're going to get this, I don't know who you are. Now, we do have the ability to do anonymous now, so at least if you were joining a meeting, you could still get in. But, yes, to your point. That's right. It doesn't have any idea. In fact, in this error, we're saying we couldn't talk to it. It's incompatible. I don't know. We just didn't get there. So why it didn't get there? It could be 15 different reasons, but it failed. But going back, we do see all we searched for was Lync Discover internal, followed by Lync Discover, stop. That's all we're looking for. We're not doing any of our SRVs. When it works successfully, it works just like it would in a query that we're looking for from a fact client, right? It's doing the Lync Discover, gets its response, gets the server pool name, off we go, good to go. Subsequent logins is similar, where we just go directly to the pool. We don't have to run this process over. So once you do get into the modern client, there's a good chance it'll work forever. Till the next upgrade, until the next patch, right? So that's the way it works. So, okay, so there's the key point from a discovery process perspective, not necessarily a usability perspective, but from a discovery, it's identical. And if you really are having problems with a particular client, either log in as somebody else, make a new profile on that machine, log into a different computer to test, and as you fix things, you're kind of bouncing around with different logins to try to make it work. But I agreed that it's a mess. Okay. So once we get through that whole process, we get to authentication. So we've worked all this time to figure out where we want to go. Now we have to actually be allowed to go there and authenticated to get there. Now, basic SIP registration, and this is where we get to the TLS DSK communication. Yeah. Excuse me, where we have all kinds of failures when you go ahead and do a SIP trace. So on the left, yep, on your left too. On the left is the snooper log, all right? So we all should be familiar with that, and a bunch of red. And if you are looking at an enterprise with 10,000, 50,000, 400, 100, 5, I don't know, however many users, you look at the morning when they're all logging in, it'll be full of red. And this is why. Because the basic registration, the way we do SIP authentication within Lync is secure. It's a two-way secure handshake that we're doing with certificates. So introduced in 2010 and 2013 is the authentication option of certificate-based authentication, or TLS DSK. What that allowed us to do was to have a certificate issued by the Lync server, completely signed by him, independent of him. It's nothing to do with your internal CA. You can't replace it with your internal CA. You can't use a public server. It has nothing to do with any of that. So you can't change this process. It just is this process. It will issue a self-signed cert and pass it on to you. If you go and look in your personal store, so not the computer store, in your personal store, you will see a certificate or one or more issued by your Lync server to you. And that certificate is what is actually granting you access to Lync. It has nothing to do with your Active Directory credentials. Short of you have to have AD to log into your physical machine to get to Lync to get to this process. But once we have a certificate issued, and that's the preferred methodology, we no longer rely on Active Directory credentials. And there's a couple implications there, right? One is, that means if we've disabled your AD account, and you have logged on a machine that's not part of the domain, so you can log into this box all you want. By default, for 6 months, since that was first issued, you can log into Lync. So you have to make sure you deprovision the user in Lync to prevent that process. That's kind of one of the unfortunate side effects. The advantages being, remote site, phones, lines go down, it doesn't matter. We don't need Active Directory to get actually logged into Lync. And the idea is to be resilient. And again, Lync is doing everything it can to get this resiliency level up, and thus we can argue that it makes issues and creates problems. But you can change the timeline of how long the certificates are. Rest of the default 6 months. Do you want them to be 1 month, 3 months, 1 year, whatever your internal processes are? 6 is picked because it's a good number. It's half of a year. And we're not actually continually requesting these certs over and over and putting a load variant on the back end, right? We have these certs. So what we're seeing here is, again, the first time we talk to Lync, I don't care what it is, I don't care what device it is, Lync says, and rejects the communication. in its rejection response, it sends back, I don't want to talk to you unless you want to talk over blah. And it gives whatever its communication options are and preferential order. TLS, DSK, in TLM, maybe you have some sort of basic auth. Whatever happens to be that we're going to be doing authentication from, that's pushed back in the rejection notice. So it's a good rejection. You don't want to be hurt feelings. It's actually required to make this process happen. Then we get, with TLS, TSK, 3 more rejections. And now your self-esteem is starting to go down because you're just getting rejected, rejected, rejected. But what's really happening is the client's giving you his certificate. He's giving you his certificate. So you have one way we're caching things back and forth. No, 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 no. Okay. You know, eventually, as long as it's all good, we're letting you in. But it's a handshake process. And it takes what looks inefficient, product group swears, is exactly what we want it to do. It's highly efficient, and it allows it to do the way we want it to do. And this is not like this is 5 seconds worth of effort. This is milliseconds worth of time that this is all happening. So that's how it works. So when you're looking through the process, just because you have red and snooper, it's not a bad thing. As long as you have these 200s every once in a while, that's a good thing. I mean, you're actually getting into making valid communications. You have registrations that actually happen. And on the right, left, right, you have the SIP tree as well. If you want to look at it from that perspective, where it's not truly unauthorized. And that's where a lot of the communication and the troubleshooting gets difficult, because the message is it's a 401, has nothing to do with the authentication of your user credentials at all. That's just basically logging in. So what do we use to look at this stuff? How do we figure out how we want to troubleshoot client-server communications? Well, we have connection issues that happen with invalid SIP URIs. Either the user's wrong, typing it wrong. In the modern client, we've typed the wrong username, whatever, something's wrong. We have invalid users. That can be hackers, that can not be hackers, that can just be fat fingering. Private certificates internally, where you tell the process to go ahead and log in, but it's a box that's not a member of your domain. Your internal CA certificate's not on it. Box can't get in. And we'll actually see a photo here of where, because we have the failover, we can continue on past Lync Discover and not our Lync Discover internal, and not Lync Discover internal, and not trusting the certificate. That's fine, because we do then fail to Lync Discover and get the response. But then we go to talk to the server. The fact client is going to be using SIP, and if we don't trust the cert at that point, boom, failures happen. Different from the mobility client that's doing it all via web services. So a little bit different of a communication. And then we can use Logger. We can use CLS Logger, which is much improved and better as time's been going on, much more accurate. We're not missing as much data, which is a good thing. And then we can use Snooper and other tools. We can use Notepad. We can use whatever we want to actually view this data, really up to you. So what happens when we have Lync Discover deployed and we want to go ahead and capture on the server a failed login? Well, unfortunately, if it is a bad SIP URI, it'll never happen. Why? Well, when the user goes to log in, and let's say he puts in, instead of DC for Davy Crockett, he typos and does FC, right next to the keyboard, it happens, FC at, in this case, brightcomplabs.com, goes to log in, it does the web query for Lync Discover, and it says that's not a valid user and kills the process, right? Done. It never gets a response back because it can't get a response because it's not a valid user. So if we were trying to watch errors on the server, we would never see errors on the server. So it makes it somewhat difficult, and it can be a little challenging from an administrator perspective, because we actually have to watch the client side, not the server side, because it never gets to the server. It is possible to go ahead and put Fiddler, by the way, on your servers. Unless something's really wrong, you probably don't want to. It's kind of mucking up the mucks world of how certificates are done and whatnot. But potentially you could do that and get the traffic, the web traffic's getting there as well. But you're not going to see from doing a SIP trace. So if we're in OCS Logger or CLS logging, you are not going to see a failed user login or credential login failure back to Lync. It's never going to get there. If we did an SRV record, however, because it's not authenticated, that's not the case. And we will actually see a nice verbose error. Hey, I mean, we're getting actual information back from Lync saying, hey, this user is not enabled for SIP, doesn't exist, wrong problem, it's the wrong information. And if we look at what's the 404 coming from, we can see that it's BB. Now, in this case, Big Bird, he is in the environment. We saw his user account in AD. However, he's not enabled for Lync, so you can't log into Lync. So it can be as simple as an SRV giving us the information in this capture. It could be more difficult in that we never get it here, and we have to look at the client side and troubleshoot the end user perspective. But that's just the way the DNS versus some of the advantages and disadvantages of Lync Discover from a troubleshooting perspective. It kind of can muck up the process. Invalid credentials. We can get very similar things, and when we look at it and break down the errors, they're obvious what they are. We just need to be knowing what we're looking for, right? So if we're looking at the communications and we see 403 forbiddens, those aren't 401 unauthorized, these are actually forbiddens, which means, this user does not have access to this user, and we're looking at the logins, we can see that it says, this user is the one that is trying to be authenticated or is authenticated, and yet they're trying to log in as LR. So Davy Crockett is trying to log in as a Lone Ranger, doesn't have access to his account, and therefore gets denied. But again, we have an actual forbidden error, and the actual error of who's logging in, that's all captured in SIP. It's all there in our SIP traces. Bad Active Directory credentials are similar, except we'll get the unauthorized, 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 fail. So we would expect things to work, and then we get the failure message back saying, that's not going to happen because you actually don't have 80 credentials now. So obviously the user has never logged in. We didn't have a certificate to exchange, and so the credentials actually failed us on that part. When we have the untrusted certificate, it's harder to see, but because of Lync Discover, it's harder to see. But what we have is the communication happens, auto-discover comes back, and we get the discovery process, right? Because we're failing, things are working, we're getting the response, we're ignoring the errors, but then Lync's going to give you this TLS, negotiation started and failed, closed before it actually happened. If you ever see that, you have certificates issued somewhere, problem. Your client doesn't trust the server and or vice versa. Something's happening where you can't talk to them. So we'll see this error on edge servers is a great example when we're doing federation. And we have no advantage of getting there. So when we're looking at those processes, we look at how things work and how things don't work, right? Okay. So now let's look and go ahead and see how that actually looks and works. Seeing? Yeah. Okay. Because I thought I was cut off in 2 minutes. I'm like, I got 12, according to my little blinky timer lighty thingies. Okay. So when we're looking at the FAT client and we want to look at logins, this is where we're going to go back to off the client, and we want to do some captures on the Lync server. So there are 3 basic things that we capture with OCS Logger, right? And when we go to CLS logging, these 3 things are captured when we do a scenario of IM&P and or the phone when we're looking at what we're trying to look for from a scenario's perspective. But almost always, we're having problems with SIP, and we want to do a SIP trace. We get a SIP trace, we can get the information back. We always want to do a high log level, so, right, that's our all, and then check the all flags, get everything. Just get all the information back. I'd rather have more information than no information. Once I get that information back, I can then parse it. So granted, in a large environment when we're doing this with hundreds of thousands of seats and we turn this on, we just made a gig of information within a matter of seconds. But we do want to try to get the information the first time and not have to go back because we overly filtered it or under-filtered the process. The other 2 that we typically look at, S4, which is SIP for mediation more or less, when you're looking at the communications configuration for setting up media traffic, and audio, as in G711 and mediation, and the mediation server itself. Those are the 3 most common things we kind of log on. But in this case, SIP stack, that's what we want to watch on. And when we watch on this particular one and create our log, there's not much going on, so all's good in a happy, happy land. But when we come back to the client, and the client decides that it wants to log in as the wrong user or with a bad password, we will see failures. Or will we? Sorry. So in this case, we have only Lync Discover, and we don't have the SRV. So when I come here, and I want to sign in as, I don't know, let's do Lone Ranger's account here, and log in, it's going to ask me for credentials because that's not my AD account. And then I type something that's not accurate, and when I do so, it fails. Now, if I go back to my Lync server and look at those logs, I will notice that I never got the logs there. They actually didn't make it to me because I didn't and was unable to authenticate the user account at the Lync Discover process level. It had nothing to do with the actual Lync environment rejecting me per se. I mean, don't get it wrong, web services is part of Lync, but it's not part of the actual registration process. Never started. It wasn't even attempted because we knew that we couldn't get there. And if we're looking at the logs and we're looking at what's here, Exchange, and keep moving down, Davy Crockett's in there, but there's no Lone Ranger attempts because, again, it never gets to the server. And that's really important. It's really important for us to watch that. Conversely, if we were to delete the Lync Discover, and so we were logging in via the SIP communications channel and not via Lync Discover, we would come here and we'd see the failure of the user not being able to communicate, which is exactly what we would expect. Okay. And with that, we will move on to mobility. Now, mobility is a big thing and sometimes frustrating. It's harder to troubleshoot because we're not just installing something like a Wireshark on the box. It's not as simple to gather logs. It's not as simple to actually peruse the logs. Ironically, well, at least ironic to myself, is the iOS logs are the best of the logs from an understanding perspective. So if you're having problems, your best bet is to grab somebody's iPhone or bring in your iPad and try it on your environment. If you do so, those logs you can kind of understand. If you try to take your Windows Phone logs, you go, that didn't do me any good. And depending on the Android version and the manufacturer and the time of day and the moonscape, right, you may or may not get anything out of its logs. You just never know. But the iOS logs are awesome logs. And they're easy to capture, and they work every time. So that's why, in my example, I'm using an Apple iPad. Now, much like a lot of the other stuff we talked about, it's only going to do Lync Discover. So if Lync Discover is not working like we would expect, we're going to have problems. The question came up yesterday, and so regarding internal certs, what's the best way to handle using devices internally, such as an iPad or an Android or Windows Phone on your internal environment? Ideally, you're loading on your internal root CAs onto these boxes. That can be cumbersome, especially when it's a BYOD environment. You don't have them in any kind of mobile device manager, so no, there's no MDM deployed or nothing that's actually managing these devices to push the certificate out. How you approach that's up to you. But we will or should fail if we can't get to that internal. And if we're set up correctly so that we have a reverse proxy pointer on our inside to get us back in and around, then we're going to make it there anyway. But if we don't, then, or if it's a Windows Phone currently, then we're not going to be able to get on. So whether you make a web page, put your root cert there, give the instructions for the 3 types of devices, general for Android, and then you can have specifics for Windows Phone and for iOS, let the users get it on. That's going to be your best end-user experience because it'll work every time, instantly get on. It also gets you access from those devices to other internal things. Exchange would be a good one that potentially is privately signed as well, and so you avoid a lot of internal issues with these devices. Again, on the iPad, not a requirement, but yeah, it should not be on the others, but it happens to be broken at the moment. So, same process, Lync Discover, then our web queries. And what we're going to show here, because bringing an iPad and doing this is not only cumbersome, I don't trust it to work the way I want it to, so we're just going to have little screenshots to go through this. But the key when we're looking at any of the 3 clients, typically, is that we're looking for the login process to work the way we want. And we're going to start with Lync Discover, right? That's just like anything else. And we can see on the process, on the box, that we do a get, and we get the Lync Discover, and part of the HTTP return happens to be the server name of what Lync Discover is, because that's part of coming back and forth as we're giving the traffic, and then we get a response back. Then it's going to move off to the web ticket request. And here we go into the web ticket service, because we now know the pool name, and the box is working. So if you're watching the log, you're like, yep, that worked. Yep, that worked. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do an auto discover. And you are logged in because you had credentials. You'll notice that it kicks back right here, the actual auto discover where we're going to. So you can actually validate that it's a valid path and things are right. All looks good. Everybody's happy. Yay. And then we actually get an auto discover response back. And you'll also see here a couple of things, that it's identical from a data perspective. The log looks slightly different just because that's the way, that's the way the Apple and the viewers and things want to show it. But it's the same data. Right? We're getting the exact same responses back. And again, we're only looking at UCWA external for these mobility clients, the way it works. We're also can tell that we are going to be looking at the internal. Doesn't mean anything to a mobility client because we're always going to be looking at the external, but he does realize he's an internal user. Not that it does anything, but FYI. But that is the information that we're getting back. Okay, so at this point, we have done what? We've done a Lync Discover on the mobility, just like the fact client. We then did a web ticket so that we could log into AutoDiscover, just like the fact client. We then logged into AutoDiscover and got the results back in XML, just like the fact client. Yet, at some point, when we go to this meetings, right, this location that we get back from AutoDiscover, it fails. And there's multiple reasons why things can fail. So the most common I see is the external DNS entry is missing. You'll notice the E connection error, blah. All right. Again, in the iOS logs, it's the best descriptives. There's pages of these things of what they are. They're always built with an error code, then 3 digits. One's signifying transport, the first one is the criticality, then the transport level. None of it's released to the public to make your life nice and easy, but if you get some troubleshooting and you get through, 2 of the most common ones which we'll show, one is the E221, the other is E225. E221 is simply saying, you're telling me to go to meetings, I can't get there. And if you're looking to see what he's actually saying, it's an error in the domain. It's an error in a DNS. DNS says, go to meetings. Meetings doesn't exist. How do I get there? Right? And the process ends. So we always want to look for these right here, right? The E connection errors. Another very common one is the 225, which is awesome. You told me to get here, but I can't. But it doesn't go anywhere. Either the IP address is wrong within the response, the reverse proxy's down, is not doing its work correctly. You physically have no access to that information. I don't know. Something's wrong with the network, and you can't get to where you're trying to get to. So it's not that DNS failed at this point. Now it's a network failure. And at this point, it's a connection timeout. So we're actually timing out trying to get to the response. So is it down? Is there issues? I don't know. But that's where we want to look. And so the key for mobility is to always test it with an Apple device and to look at the logs, look for the E-connections. And that'll give you some insight into what's going on, hopefully. They're not always as descriptive. It can be a little bit more, aloof at times, but they do try. And maybe someday they'll be released. That would be nice. They keep the long list. And there's a long list. And they're different per device. So Android's list is slightly different than Windows, is slightly different than iOS. Because that makes sense, right? Have different error codes. All the same numbers mean different things depending on which device you're on. That's awesome. So with that, we are done with the session. I'm opening up the floor for questions. We do have 5. Ooh, Skype cards, right? That anybody asks a question, you'll get a card. So I can hand these out. We also want to remind that before we get there, that we thank obviously everyone for coming, that my link to fill in your session, don't forget to fill in your evals. We super need them. There still are the hands-on labs till 1 o'clock today or 1:30. But the real key point is to make sure that you fill out those session evals because we need those in order to make this conference better next year when we do the conference. So, yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the Mac sign-on process and troubleshooting that?
So, you probably, the Lync process conceptually is the same on a Macintosh. However, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't come back. Troubleshooting it becomes cumbersome because we don't have the same tools and logs. We do have logs. They do exist on the Macintosh. It's all Unix-based logging, so we can get that information. Generally speaking, you're using some sort of port-based query in the Unix command shell UI to figure out where you're going. Really, it's difficult. It comes down to, it's not open. It's not an open platform, and so we don't have the same troubleshooting. But the discovery process is the same. We're doing the same thing. We're doing the same thing. With the latest version, 14.4, I think it is you can use the Lync Discover process as well as the SIP, but we'll always be able to do SIP in that process. That should always work. And the Macs either work or they don't. I mean, it's just,
Well, I see a lot of issues with or problems with certificate issuance to the Macs.
That can happen. And when you go to make your certificates, again, if you're doing internals and you're internal to the network, he has to trust your internal. Well, you have 2 options. You either pay a lot of money and get external certs on everything in your environment, which some companies will do because they just don't want to deal with an internal CA. Alternatively, You can install a root certificate on the Macintoshes. It's just not an easy process. It's much similar to the iPad, and we have to open up the root store, and it takes administrative rights, and you have to then install the roots, and then the intermediates sometimes work, and sometimes they don't, and it's a huge mess. Yeah. So, yep, you're welcome. Hand out my cards. Thanks. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about primary pull machine in presence order? So when you create a Lync account, it kind of assigns you to a specific pool.
Yes, based off the Fabric's doing a lot of decision making for you, but yes.
Right, and the issue that what we see is sometime when specific machine that you are assigned to front end, when troubleshooting it, the help desk technician that we have don't have access to the Lync backend.
Okay.
So how do they find out while they troubleshoot? Thanks. How do they troubleshoot without knowing the backend?
Well, there's no simple way. We do have RBAC. We have right-space authentication, right, that can happen. You can make a custom RBAC rule that allow them to run a query. Query you want to run is get-cs user pool, pool info pool, and it'll pull back your preferential order, and that shows what pool you're actually on, assuming it's up. But you could give them the rights to run that one command, and you could do it to allow them to run it remotely as well, so they don't even have to be on the servers. They just need the PowerShell command that's loaded on their box. But there's no magic way to find that out per se, and it can change every night. Your Fabric is going to kind of level things out as needed, so you could very well be on pool 1 today, and then it decides that's a really busy pool, and so we're going to move a couple users around and kind of separate things, and the next day you're on a different pool, a different server in the pool, right? I mean, it's the Fabric. It's the magic in the back.
So the Lync client not going to tell?
Not necessarily. Sometimes you will see on the Lync client, and then we're running over, and then oh, okay. And so obviously we're done, but if you want to stay, feel free. That if we come here to the Lync client and do our configuration information, which right now did I fix? Oh, that's because I did the wrong user. We can see information. Now, obviously on an SE, it's kind of obvious where you're logging into because there's only one place to log into, right? So it's not going to be as wow factor. But when we come in here and we get our configuration information, or we're doing a trace, we could potentially be seeing the server pool that we're actually talking to. Because if we have a Wireshark up, we know exactly who we're talking to. That also means you could do a netstat-an, filter it on :5061, and you're going to see what server you're physically actually talking to. However, if it is a pool server, it could just be the pool name that we're going to bring back. Like in this information, where we pull back where our home server is, which is always changing its location somewhere here there it is, connected to Lync, right? But that could very well be SIP, and it could be very generic. So it's not going to necessarily tell us here where we're going, because that's the DNS query is what we're caching here. So.
All right.
Yep. But the only way to really know is to go ahead and do a query on the back end.
Got it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. Anything else? All right. Thank everybody for coming, and don't forget to fill out your evals. Thank you.